located in Southern California. Fuller's a multi-denominational seminary, so we've got people from about more than 40 different denominations, 100 different countries. I did realize as I've interacted with some Episcopalians, if you've ever heard of Miroslav Volf or Willie James Jennings, both of whom are at Yale, Miroslav Volf was a longtime Fuller Seminary professor, and then Willie James Jennings is on our board of trustees. So if either of those names help locate kind of who and where Fuller is, we can have more of that conversation later if anybody wants to know more information. The other point of clarification that I will offer, when I cited the Pew Research and other statistics about the decline of the church, let me be very clear. I don't think that the decline of the Christian faith in the United States is inevitable, but it is what's projected, okay? So it's not inevitable. I'm actually an optimist. I think the best days of church and faith can actually be ahead of us in the United States. I think that's very possible, but that's not the overall trajectory that we see in the United States. This analogy may be helpful for some of you. Who has watched something on Netflix in the last month? Can you raise your hand? Okay. Who's rented a video at Blockbuster in the last month? Okay, who's rented a video at Blockbuster in the past? Most of us, okay. So if you're Blockbuster 15 years ago, you might have begun to see the decline of people coming to your stores to rent videos, right? So the way that people were watching and renting movies started to change a number of years ago. The idea of watching movies has not gone away. I would say, if anything, it's just increased. The way that people watch movies, how we engage with watching movies has changed. Yeah, there's this small company that's come along you might have heard of called Netflix, who started with the idea of you could just have DVDs delivered to you by mail, or you could show up to a little kiosk and get it. Well, that evolved into you can just push a button and stream and watch a movie without ever having, some of you are, yes, just enjoying the idea of what Netflix provides. Every analogy breaks down. I think that could be a decent analogy for what's happening with young people and faith in our country, is when you look at the faith of young people, belief in Jesus is not going away, at least it hasn't. Prayer has not gone away. Engaging with Scripture, needing freedom from anxiety, a desire to engage in justice. Many of those things have actually increased with a younger generation in terms of their hope, their passion, their interest. The reason I think that that is a worthwhile analogy for us is if young people continue to feel strong and serious about faith, it's the form of church that they are not connecting with so much. This conversation is an invitation to think about what are the aspects of church that we need to do exactly the same way because they're, God ordained and we have to do it that way. But what are just some of the things that we do it this way because we've done it this way for a long time? It's not sacred, it's not commanded in Scripture, it's not even, passed on from and high from the Episcopal Church. It's those sorts of things that we need to be thinking about. So for some of you, if that analogy helps, right? Blockbuster went out of business because they did not change with the times. Now, I'm aware I'm in D.C. Like, somebody could have been a consultant to Blockbuster during that time, right? So I'm painting with a broad, or maybe somebody's attorney for Blockbuster, right? But painting with a broad brush. But that's part of what happened with Blockbuster. Netflix took that same idea that people want to watch movies, but changed the format and the access. Let me take that a step further. What we're hearing from many young people is getting up at 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning and, showing up to the service. Maybe, maybe not. The idea of a Tuesday evening, let's say Thursday evening, maybe at a bar with a group of friends talking faith. Now, I'm not saying one is better or worse. I'm just saying I don't think Jesus gave a clear command about either one in Scripture. So sometimes just the fact that faith looks and is expressed different, the different can mean scary or threatening or we don't know how to respond. I'll go back to this projection about the decline of Christianity, right? That's to raise the level of urgency because this is the direction we're headed. That does not mean it's inevitable. And to go back even further, I would just say, part of the core aspect of Jesus is life, death, resurrection, and resurrection's a very important part of that, right? We have a faith and a history and a Jesus that is about new beginnings and new starts and renewal. I think that we need to take that seriously in our own approach. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify that from a couple of questions that I got. Anybody else have a question before we start on this keychain leadership piece? Any questions before we start on keychain leadership? Yeah, let's go one right here, maybe one more, and then we'll pick it up.
I realized belatedly that I didn't know what the opening quote meant.
I think it was on.
There we go.
There we go.
That what does it mean to the role of a leader is to define what does it mean to define reality in the way you're talking about it?
Yep, good question. And again, I would just say defining reality is about statistics, but it's also just about being very serious about what's happening in our local congregation. And that would be my hope for each of you, is that you're being very serious about just where are we right now? Oftentimes we hesitate or don't want to acknowledge the way things are because it's scary. I'm wrapping up a PhD, and that PhD is focused on congregational change. And one of the scarier books that I've read, there's a book out there called Change or Die, okay? And Change or Die, it's not a church book, it's a study on change. And one of the things that the author looks at is one of the largest studies that's been done of heart patients in the United States. People who have been told, change your lifestyle, change these things, or you're going to die. And the statistic is something like 90% of patients in that study did not make the changes that they needed to make to preserve their life. And so the question that the author asks is, when faced with life and death change, if most of us are not able to make the changes that we need to make, what hope do we have? I find that sobering. Now there's, climate change and other things. Part of the reason we're here today is when it comes to the church, there are very real and tangible things that we need to do. Many of us say, well, we don't want to become like that non-denominational church up the street, right? And part of what I'm here to tell you is there's ways of doing this that fit your identity, your core, who you are. That's what we're here to talk about. So good question. One more question, otherwise we'll keep going. All right, we'll keep going. So if you turn to the second page in your handout, at the top, it should say Unlock Keychain Leadership. Unlock Keychain Leadership. Here we go. So when we got into our research, this is the first line on the top of page 2, when we got into these churches and began to study them, 3/4 of the churches that we studied pointed to leadership as the reason that they were effective with younger generations. Okay, 3/4 of the congregations and those in the congregations pointed to leadership as the reason why they were effective with younger generations. But just pointing to leadership, that's fairly broad, so we need to break that down a little bit. First, I want to say there was a myth that we uncovered in our research, and that myth was that to be effective with young people, you need a young, hip leader. Okay, that's the myth. It is a myth that if you want to be effective with young people, you need a young, hip leader. Now, we have a rector from Southern California here. Drinking a Starbucks, definition of young, hip. Sorry, I get to catch up on the commentary from the front table, so I'm just enjoying what they're saying. But again, it's a myth that if you want to reach young people, you have to have a young, hip leader. If you're paying attention to the news or what happens at a lot of church conferences, there's reasons this myth is reinforced. We often tend to platform young, hip people. Now, after this slide, what we used to have was a set of slides that showed you some of the leaders who were in our study, but also those who are young and hip and weren't in our study. We no longer have those photos because 2 of those younger, hip pastors have since had very public moral failures and are no longer leading their congregations. So I do just want to recognize there is an element of kind of a celebrity church and celebrity pastor culture that is not sustainable, that doesn't come with the rhythms that we need. I'll say one of the wonderful things that the Episcopal Church has is the sense of longevity and history and stability. I think we can balance that out with some innovation and responsiveness, right? But some of that responsiveness that comes in other churches could also balance out and have some of the stability, consistency, those sorts of things. Let me show you a photo, though, of this is not one of the pastor's moral failure, right? This is not that picture. This is a pastor on the positive side that we want to talk about. So in our study, we met, this is Pastor Stretch, okay? So his real name is Stephen. Since he was a kid, Stretch was his nickname, so Pastor Stretch. Pastor Stretch is a Nazarene pastor, okay? So Nazarene denomination. He was pastoring a church in Pennsylvania, Lansdale, if anybody's been through Lansdale, Pennsylvania. And they were one of the churches that was nominated for our study as being incredibly effective with younger people. And as we dug into that, the life and culture of the church, yeah, they had a very high percentage of teenagers and young adults. So we visited the church as part of our research, and we were asking the younger people just what is it about this church that makes it the sort of church that you want to be a part of? And so many of them kept saying, oh, it's just Pastor Stretch. It's the way that he leads. And we thought, okay, enough people have said that we need to talk to Pastor Stretch. So we ended up in his office, and we said, hey, so many young people in this church are talking about the way that you lead. Can you help us understand more of that? And he said, I can. But to tell you that story, I need to take you back to when I turned 16 years old. So we're rewinding to when Pastor Stretch was 16 years old, growing up in Pennsylvania. He had grown up in Boston. We'll get to that in a minute. But living in Pennsylvania at age 16, he passed his driver's test and got his driver's license. And so his parents had said, Stretch, here's the keys to the family car. You can take it out for your first drive by yourself. So Stretch is pulling out of his driveway, turns onto the road, is trying to figure out where he's going to go. And he thinks, well, I love to be at church. I'll drive to church. So he pulls into the church. The child care at the church is wrapping up for the day. They had an after-school child care program. And the child care director had known Stretch for years, and she thought, hey, Stretch, you have your driver's license. Would you want to help us out with the child care after school? And she went on to say, we'll pay you to help out and all these sorts of things. And Stretch thought, well, I like to be at church. I like to hang out with kids, and I like getting paid. So yeah, that sounds great. I can help out. And so she said, all right, I need to go in and get something. I'll be right back. She comes back outside, and she puts a key into his hand. Okay, and she said, Stretch, this is a key to the church. And she went on to say, there will be times that I'm going to need you to unlock, doors or get some supplies from over here, so you're going to need this key. Now, as far as Stretch told us in that moment, he did not hear a word she said after she said, here's a key to the church, right? Because Stretch, as a 16-year-old, is thinking, my pastor has this key, my Sunday school teacher has this key, people in my church with power and authority, they're the ones who have this key. Now, quick pause, moral of the story is not to give every 16-year-old in your church a key. Are we clear on that? We do need to adjust for time and place and safety protocols, but right, different time, different era, so Stretch has a key to the church. Stretch comes back to the church the next day, and he's helping with the child care. The youth leader in the church comes to him, and says, hey, Stretch, we have a soda machine in the church. I've been stocking it for a long time. We need someone to take over stocking the soda machine. Would you be willing to take that responsibility? If you do, it comes with all of the Mountain Dew that you can drink. Yeah, for Stretch as a 16-year-old, the Mountain Dew was better than the cash, right? So that was an easy yes for him. So you got to keep in mind, at 16, Stretch now has keys to the family car, keys to the church, and keys to the soda machine. Life is pretty good for Pastor Stretch. Next day, he's back to help with the childcare. He ends up in the gym. Did this used to be a gym? Did this used to have basketball hoops? No? Okay. Well, anyway, he ended up in the church gym. Stretch is Nazarene, so you can interpret this statement in the way that fits you. Stretch said he heard the voice of God speaking to him. He had been playing basketball, but at one point ended up in the gym by himself. He said it wasn't an audible voice, but he knew God was speaking to him. And apparently the first words God said were, hey, Stretch. And Stretch responded, yeah, God. And Stretch had grown up in Boston, so you can, do that better than me. But God said, Stretch, you really like being here in the church, don't you? And Stretch said, yes, God, I do. And God said, well, Stretch, I want you to get very comfortable because you're going to be spending a lot of time here in the future. And for Stretch as a 16-year-old, he said that was the last kind of key, right, that he needed to receive before he was ready to give himself over to a life of service and leadership in the future of the church. And so back in his office with him, when we were with him, he went on to say, so in the years that followed after that, I just had adult after adult who came to me in the church, gave me a key. Now that could be a physical key. Oftentimes it was just some area of authority and responsibility. And Stretch said, by all measures of the imagination, he was not like a superstar 16-year-old, right? Like he didn't go to an Ivy League school. He was not voted most likely to succeed. He just had adults who came to him, who saw potential in him, and gave him an area of authority or responsibility. And he said, so as I went through life in the church and I went to seminary and I became a pastor, he said, nobody had to train me in this. I just thought the way that you lead is you are just always looking for someone younger, someone around you, and helping them have an area of authority or responsibility. So reflecting on that story from Pastor Stretch, and building on the research that we had identified, we came to call this area Keychain Leadership. So if you go to your handout, we're on that Keychain Leadership section. It says this: beyond simply launching a student leadership team, keys refer to capabilities, power, and access of leaders who carry the potential to empower young people. And let me explain just a little more. The analogy here is if you have a set of keys, you usually hold those keys together on a keychain or a key ring, right? And one way to handle your keys is that those keys always stay with you on your keychain because they're your keys. The question when it comes to the church is, for a lot of the adults who have been in the church for a long time, we have acquired a number of keys, whether they're literal or metaphorical. The question is, for those of us who hold a lot of keys in the church, are we going to continue to hold those keys ourselves, or will we actually invite young people to take those keys on and to use those sorts of keys? Now, the research that goes along with this is from us and this is from others, is that one of the best ways to pass on the faith, one of the best ways to have young people who want to be part of their church is when they have and when they feel a sense of agency, right? Agency shows up in all different areas of life. Agency is a predictor of better outcomes. An agency is simply, right, you are an agent. You can interact with and respond to and shape the world around you. When young people have a sense of agency in the church, that they have a role to play, that they can shape things, young people are much more likely to stick with their faith. They are much more likely to stick with the church. If young people see the church as this fixed thing that they have no way to be a part of, shape, or change, and all they can do is sit by passively and observe what's going to happen, what the research shows is oftentimes we are training young people, church is not the place for your gifts, it's not the place for you to shape things, it's not the place for you to engage. Now you need to put alongside of that, younger people have an unprecedented number of ways to engage with their world. Whether people are listening or not, social media, all sorts of other areas, young people can interact with and shape their world. But if young people who are engaging with church see, oh, well, that's just the way we've done it, we're always going to do it, there's no different way of doing things, then I would say we are actually training young people. Church is not the place for you, it's not the place to use your gifts. Let me say a little bit more about that, and then we'll have some time to take questions. We find that there are 3 ways that leaders can use their keys, and this goes back to your handout here. So 3 ways that leaders can use their keys. We would say on the one hand, there are keyless leaders in the church, keyless leaders. Now when we say keyless, we mean like have not received a key yet. So if you think about Pastor Stretch when he's 16 before he gets those keys, there are people in your church who they are not holding any or many keys. We then think there are key hoarding leaders. Okay, key hoarding leaders. You might know a key hoarding leader. Maybe you're sitting by a key hoarding leader. Maybe that's you, but you just don't know it yet. That's why we're all here to talk together. But that key hoarding leader is that person who's holding the keys. They're never going to let go of the keys. You know, you'll have to pry those keys from their cold, dead fingers at some point. But then there's this idea of keychain leaders, and keychain leaders are those who are willing, well, I'll say first of all, it begins with awareness. Keychain leaders are aware of the keys that they actually hold, but then they are willing to take a key off of their keychain, to remove it, and to share it with a younger person. And I will add that if they've tried that once and the younger person is either too busy or doesn't know how to use it, that adult is willing to journey with them, listen to them, we'll talk more about this in a minute, to figure out what does it look like for that young person to lead with and use that key. We think that the analogy of driver's education can be helpful to think about for keychain leadership, so just go with me for a second here. If you want to teach a younger person how to drive, and has anybody ever taught a younger person younger than you how to drive? Anybody? Some of us have done that, some of us not. So if you've ever done that, what's a busy highway around DC? Beltway. What is it? Beltway. Beltway. So if you were going to teach a younger person how to drive, would you just hand them the keys to your current vehicle and say, take it out on Beltway and you'll figure it out? Okay, imagining that's not the way that you're going to do things. If you want to teach a younger person how to drive, would you keep them sitting in the back seat until they're age 50 and say, you know, make sure you've paid attention over 50 years, and then you'll be at the point where we can trust you to drive? Now, I'm going to guess those 2 ways are not the ways that you do it. So we've actually created something called driver's education, right? Where the first way that young people learn how to drive is from, and this is important, sitting in the car with us, often for a number of years before they ever get behind the wheel themselves. There's this whole element of, for many of us, the worst habits we've seen in our own children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, neighbors, they have picked up from watching us drive, right? Because they've been in that car with us. But from there, before young people ever get behind the wheel of a car, they spend some time in classes actually learning about what driving is like. The first time they get behind the wheel, we find a big, empty parking lot with few things that you can run into. And we go around at very slow speed, right? And then after that, the first time a young person takes a car out for themselves, almost every time, there is someone in the other side of the car with them, a driving instructor who typically has access to an emergency brake, right, to slow down just in case. What we don't do in driver's ed is tell young people, hey, sorry, we're too busy to teach you how to drive. We don't throw the keys at them from 50 feet away and just say, take it and figure it out. There is this give and take process. Now, on the one hand, we can say, oh, that must be this new invention. Let's go to the New Testament for a second. How did the disciples ever figure out how to lead and do the whole Christian thing? Jesus journeyed with them. There was this back and forth pass-off. You don't need to be a Bible scholar to answer this, but did the disciples get it right their first time? Okay, how about their second time? Or fifth time, right? We find Jesus identifying this younger group of people who end up making all of these mistakes, yet somehow end up building on and founding this movement that we've inherited now 2,000 years later. So we'll talk about some practical aspects of that in a second. I do want to offer a few practical ideas that you can take into account in your context. The first one is this. If you want to take a next step in this area, one idea is to identify who's ready for keys. Now, here's what we mean by this. Identifying who's ready for keys is as simple as on your sheet of paper, you could write down the names of 1, 2, or 3 younger people. Okay? 1, 2, or 3 younger people, the name of a real younger person. But then next to their name, you could write down what is a key that they might be able to take on. Okay, what's a key they might be able to take on? Now, for those of you who say we don't have any teenagers or young adults in your church, hey, that's okay. We're talking about shifting culture. If the average age in your church is 75 or 80, the younger generation is age 50 or 60. Now, we have been there where there are 50-year-olds who say, I have never been given an area of authority or responsibility. This is where we want to learn to crawl before we walk. If you have a church that's average age is 80, truly growing younger is figuring out what to do with those who are age 50. And that is step one before you start with teenagers. Does that make sense? I see some nodding heads from St. Dunstan's. Okay, great. But identifying who's ready for keys. The second one is this. When it comes to vulnerability, be willing to go first. Okay? When it comes to vulnerability, be willing to go first. We use this idea of driver's education, and we said that we can't expect young people to just take it out on, it was Beltway, right? That's the busy highway. Take it out on Beltway right away. We find that for a lot of younger leaders in the church, they feel like they're kind of thrown into the deep end right away without anybody to walk with them or help them figure it out. Part of what Jesus did was actually walking with his disciples, was sending them out, they made some mistakes, and then coming back and debriefing with them. Are we creating the space for young people to be able to make those mistakes? The other idea is this, to empower young leaders to envision new doors with new keys. Okay, to envision younger leaders, empower younger leaders to envision new doors with new keys. The challenge is that may mean no more business as usual. Okay, that may mean no more business as usual. Let me give 2 examples of what that looks like, because there's a couple of pushbacks we hear sometimes when we talk about this idea of keychain leadership. The first pushback that we hear is that, well, what do we do for really, really young members in our church, really the younger children? How early can we start this idea of keychain leadership? And one of my favorite stories of keychain leadership is from a pastor who works with us who's in the Pacific Northwest, and he's in a very small community, very small congregation. And he had been talking to his church about this idea of keychain leadership. And there were some parents in the church who had a 4-year-old. And they were trying to think, well, how could our 4-year-old get involved in leadership? And they thought about it, and they thought, all right, we're going to make him a greeter. Okay? And so one Sunday, this 4-year-old, and mom or dad was hanging somewhere nearby, they kind of knew what was going on, but this 4-year-old was put with a 70 or 80-year-old man in the congregation who had been there for a long time. So when everyone is showing up to the church, you've got this 80-year-old man with this 4-year-old boy standing next to each other, greeting everybody. And, the 4-year-old took a little while to warm up to it, but the 4-year-old's paying attention and notices that, when somebody comes in, the 80-year-old, steps forward and shakes their hand and then steps back. The 4-year-old was kind of slumped over a little bit and, picking his nose or something. But he notices that the 80-year-old kind of has his hands behind his back, so the 4-year-old's kind of, hands behind his back. Well, it goes well and everybody loves it. But what the 4-year-old noticed and told his parents after the service, first of all, his first words to his parents were, "I want to do that again." Because he saw how people's face lit up when they saw him. He noticed the attention, right? That was not a small thing. And they thought, "Oh, you're so cute," whatever. But the 4-year-old noticed he was not dressed like the 80-year-old man. The 4-year-old was, it was a fairly casual church, so shorts and whatever. And he said, "I want to look like the 80-year-old man," who had a full suit on. So the next Sunday, parents get 4-year-old a suit. And so at this small congregation, you've got 4-year-old in a suit next to 80-year-old in a suit greeting people as they show up to church. That became a point of pride in this church. You better believe that this idea started to spread throughout the congregation, that no one is too young to take on authority and leadership, right? That is just one step towards shifting the culture of your church. Now, let me move to the other side of this. Somebody did ask me about this on the break, and we do get questions around keychain leadership. What do you do when people don't want the keys, right? Or what do you do when you give them the keys and they don't handle the keys very well? 2 quick points that I will say about that. One piece that I will say about that is there is very much this idea of mentoring and support that has to go along with sharing the keys, right? So mentoring and support that has to go along with sharing the keys. I have a business background, so one of the things that I like to read is Harvard Business Review and business books. So I was reading one on the plane on the way over here, and it was talking about 80% of Fortune 500 companies have mentoring programs built in for their new employees, right? So best practice in the business world, I'm just going to go back to, we're talking about New Testament, Jesus and disciples, we're walking along with them. If there is a younger person who's either not handling those keys well or doesn't want to take on the keys, I would wonder, how can we actually make sure that our relational investment in them, the trust that we're building, the guidance that we're providing, matches what we're asking them to do? The other part of that, though, let me go back to Netflix and Blockbuster. You might be asking young people to lead in a way that feels very Blockbuster to them. You want them to stock the shelves and whatever is the equivalent of stocking the shelves, stacking the chairs and this and that. And they're saying well, isn't there a different way of doing this? It would be more natural for me to do this. You can either say, well, we don't do things that way here, we do things this way. Or you can actually engage them to the point to understand, well, what is it that they're thinking about? What is the way that they're seeing it? Let me give you one very quick example of this. There was a busy soccer family in a church. Has anybody ever had a busy soccer family in your church? Okay. And so in this community, the pastor had just gotten tired. She had just gotten tired of asking families to show up to church and be involved in all of this because she was competing with soccer. And at one point, one of the parents said, and this was a Methodist denomination, a Methodist church, one of the parents said, hey, I've been talking with a few of the other parents. It's hard for me to get to the church during soccer season, but if I were to actually organize and set up everything nearby on the soccer field, is there any way you could bring a guitar or someone to give a short sermon? And the pastor ended up saying yes, and it was going to be after the normal church service. The pastor, and the reason that I mentioned that they're a Methodist church, This is very John Wesley in terms of theology. So Methodist Church, founded by John Wesley. John Wesley didn't really fit in the established churches, so John Wesley went out to where people worked and all that and brought the gospel there. So there's nothing more Methodist than actually bringing the gospel to where people are. Well, the pastor ended up going there, set up by and organized by this one parent. The first weekend, they had dozens of families who showed up for worship on the soccer field, and it was kids in cleats and everything, right, and whatever. They had a few hundred families who were showing up for worship on the soccer field after a few weeks. Very few of those were actually families from the church. It was all sorts of other families who thought, wait, there's church happening at the soccer field after the game? No, it wasn't the full-blown what everything would be. It was like a 20-minute service, but that was just an example of, are we asking people to do something that just doesn't quite fit where they are? Might there be new ways and innovative? The reason that I'm mentioning it's a Methodist church, that's not like unheard of, why would we do? They're actually following their tradition and their identity by bringing church to the soccer field. That's a very natural sort of thing. So those are a few points on Keychain Leadership. What I want to do now is make sure that we are still on time here, and we are. I'm going to give you just about 10 minutes to talk with those from your church, and here's what I'd love for you to focus on. I'd love for you to focus on, based on what you heard, what is one next step your church could take? Okay, just what's one tangible next step your church could take related to Keychain Leadership? And I actually realized I have one slide I need to share with you. Sorry, I thought I was going to my title slide. We think this is an important statement. The enthusiasm or passion of young people is not your church's problem, it's your church's solution. Okay, the enthusiasm or passion of your church's young people is not your problem, it is your solution. And there is a way of saying, oh, young people, they're so enthusiastic about this or that thing over here, but not about this. We would actually say, how do you stop fighting that energy and passion, and how do you actually connect to that energy and passion and help young people realize that God has actually put that desire to create and shape inside of them, and think about what that means for your church. But the conversation that we do want you to have for about 10 minutes, thinking about Keychain Leadership, what is one next step? Not 10 next steps. What is one next step that your church could take in this area? So take about 10 minutes. And then in a few minutes, we'll go to a break.